Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Tiny Bookstore Live. I am the owner of the Tiny Bookstore, Leah Bickerton, and today we're going to be covering a few interesting topics. We're going to have Dr. DeLouis Terlonge Jr. on stream to talk with us about basically how to really best utilize a pediatrician and establish a good relationship with them. We're also going to be talking about how to break a reading slump and getting into a little bit about critical thinking and what that actually does entail. But to get things started, I'm going to introduce Dr. DeLouis Terlonge Jr. Just as a little bit of a heads up and disclosure, he is my brother. Yes, this is the last of the siblings, and yes, my parents are proud. But ultimately, he's coming in today to give this talk. He is a doctor who is currently based in Eswatini in Africa. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. DeLouis Terlonge Jr. Okay, Dr. D, thank you very much for joining us today. So what exactly would you like me to call you? Okay, I'm just going to call you DeLouis because it's easier that way.
I have one correction to make, though.
Ooh, okay.
You said I'm the last of the siblings. Hello, last on the show, firstborn.
Well, that's just how it rolls. The other ones I'm sorry, they're easier to schedule. They stayed on the continent.
Yeah.
But again, thank you for joining us today and to give us a little bit of education, because one of the concerns that I've had over the last few years, but more recently, is that a lot of parents don't necessarily know a lot about what pediatricians actually do. We know that, y'all are the ones that we take our kids to make sure that they're growing on time and they're missing they're meeting all of their different, basically all of that they're doing the way that they're supposed to be doing. And when they're sick, we bring them in. But in talking to Keith a few weeks ago, I realized that, a lot of the psychosocial development aspects that a lot of times parents don't necessarily catch, sometimes pediatricians do. And that made me think, a lot of times we don't understand what pediatricians do. So I guess the first question that I have for you is, what do pediatricians do?
Well, I mean, the easiest way to, I guess, understand it is I look at us as the hub for a child. And when I say child, I mean from baby all the way up until 24, 25, 26 years old through youth. We're basically the hub. So the guardian of their health, not just the physical health, but emotional, mental health as well. So being the primary care physician for the doctor, that means we make sure that they're okay. When they're not okay, we do what we can to help to make them okay. And then if we need help, that's when we refer out to whatever specialist is required to help with that particular situation.
Mm-hmm. And how exactly should a parent know whether a specialist is going to be needed or not?
More often than not, the pediatricians, in assessing the child's issues, whatever the issues are, they'll determine whether, say, for example, if it's a heart problem, that would be pediatric cardiology. If it's a behavioral issue that with my psychosocial skills I cannot handle, or I need more assistance, then referring out to a psychologist, or if there's a possibility of counseling and medication that's needed, maybe a psychiatrist and psychologist combination. It just depends on the assessment. Okay. And what
So I guess what I'm kind of thinking is that ordinarily when we're getting ready for the well visit, we know that we're going to get grilled about, how the kids are eating, how they're sleeping, like what's going on, screen time, all of that. So a lot of times, like to me, it feels like getting ready to testify in court. And most people are very prepared to plead the fifth, right? So, as far as this entire, only giving necessary information, is that what parents should be doing, or should we be more forthcoming about things?
In general, because of the fact that our job, our focus and goal is to make sure that the child is okay in the context of the environment that they're in, holding information back when we're asking isn't exactly good to do. So it depends on the doctor that you go and see, but we're very dependent on the history that's given. And we're trained to combine the history that's given from the questions that we ask, what the patients tell us, combine it with the exam and whatever investigations that we get to come up with the most likely conclusion, diagnosis for what's going on. Now, if any part of that assessment from the history to the physical is off or wrong or a flat out lie, then that means the conclusion and the diagnosis is also wrong, which then the treatment might become problematic or not effective enough. So it's always important to make sure that they're honest with the pediatrician about what's going on so that we can do the best we can for the child.
Okay, but the thing is that as a parent, no one knows my child better than me. So, how exactly do you balance that against the fact that as a doctor, you have a degree, you've been through medical school, and that's what your expertise is in. But as far as my child is concerned, that's where my expertise is. So, why should I defer to what you have to say since I am the expert as far as my child is concerned?
Well, the issue with the expert opinion that parents have is that they might know some of the things in terms of of relating to the child, but as far as like some of the background stuff, they may not. Unfortunately, most adults tend to forget how they felt when they were younger, how they actually, and you felt this, I felt this, that sometimes the adults actually don't know how we're feeling, what we're thinking, don't understand. You don't know me. That whole thing. So for me, being the pediatrician and being the objective person on the outside, and also understanding that even though each individual is individual, there are very common things that happen psychologically, biologically, and how they develop and stuff as well. And so in a situation like where the parent might be, ruffled feathers and bristle at the presence of the pediatrician trying to say, hey, look, consider this. I always tell the parents, like, look, we're part of a team. You have your day-to-day experience 24/7 with the child, not even 24/7, because there are some times, like, for example, at school where you don't see what the child is going through, what they're doing. And also being so close and so closely related to the child, it's oftentimes difficult to be completely objective. And in lacking the objectivity, you miss even one small thing that might be the difference between that child being a happy child and achieving the success that they're supposed to, or ending up having either physical or even worse, psychological, emotional issues that will plague them for a significant time. So for me, I don't look at it as you're an expert, like you are an expert in your way, I'm an expert in my way. When we come together as a team, then we perform better as a whole.
Okay, and I guess I get that, but as a parent, I'm the team leader. So when it comes to my child's care, why should I defer to a doctor? Because again, like, I'm the team leader. You're not. I know my child better. And, I know that you're saying that there are certain things that I'm not seeing because of school, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, if your opinion happens to conflict with mine, why should I defer to you?
Well, the deferring or not is obviously the choice that the parent has. Unfortunately, in many cases, and I've seen this plenty of times, unfortunately, there's a certain, I don't necessarily want to call it arrogance, but I think in the idea, the protective mindset that some parents have, like they're almost not willing to actually open their minds to other perspectives, like the professional perspective, like the years of schooling and all the practice that we went through to have the knowledge that we have to share. So obviously, like, is your child, you can do whatever you want, but the caveat in the back is if you don't take into account what the professional is saying and the professional happens to be right, and then you're in a situation that's a bit difficult, then there's going to be consequences with that. And so again, it's very, very important to kind of, I guess, add a little bit of humility, whether you're the doctor or the parent, and understand that there are certain things that you know, but there are certain things that I know as well. And the best picture is the picture that puts all the pieces together. And sometimes that also means being open to the possibility that maybe there's a gap in what the parent is seeing is very important for the child. I see it all the time in my office where sometimes the parents will say one thing, especially with teenagers, for example. And when the parents step out of the room, the teenager comes in and actually says something quite different than what the parent is thinking and what they think that they know. And it actually causes a huge conflict between the child and the parent. there are some situations where even actually the child actually feels as if they're better able to relate to me because I'm listening to their side of the story versus blocking out, what's happening. And so my job becomes more like a referee to kind of bring everything together and pointing it in the right direction.
Okay, I guess that's fair enough. But as a parent, I would do anything for my child. It's my child. As a pediatrician, it's a paycheck. Like we don't know what's really motivating you as a doctor because you're doing it for money, right?
No, if you look at if you ever look at if you read, I think they print this every year. I can't remember where. Like, look at the pay scale for doctors. Pediatricians are either the least paid or the second least paid out of all of them, and having to deal with, like you said, parents who more often than not think that they know more than I do. Arguments, phone calls, dealing with the illnesses, the coughing, the flus, like the writing letters, the assessments, this and that. So to a certain degree, the for us to be pediatricians and doing what we do, there's a lot more to it than just the money. Most pediatricians that you meet, there's even a different personality that they have, a certain warmth that you don't find. No offense to the other professions, but overall, it's understood that pediatricians are a bit more soft, more sort of like personable on the child level than some of the other doctors. So yeah, trust me, if money were the issue, I'd be doing banking or something else, not being a pediatrician. Yeah.
But yeah, I guess that's fair. So, of course, I'm going to address this elephant in the room:
Okay.
vaccines. And I had to do it. I had to do it. Ultimately, a lot of people have different attitudes when it comes to vaccines of all different kinds. And the impression that a lot of people get based upon their own research is that y'all are doing this for money. Like we've seen the pens that has like the name of a drug company on it. So why exactly should we be doing these vaccines? Because y'all are getting lunches, you're getting pens, notepads, all of this swag. So why should we trust that? Because aren't y'all being bought?
You want to know what's always funny to me is that if people look at pens and notebooks as being lucrative, it's very, very funny to me because the way I look at it is, oh, great, now I don't have to buy it because somebody gave it to me so I can put my money someplace else.
That's fair. That's fair.
So it's not even fair. It's actually true. That's what I usually do. I'm like, look, if they're going to give me a pen, all I got to do is just listen to them, analyze like what they're saying to see if it fits or not. That's all they're asking for. There's no commitment to actually prescribing or using whatever the product is. So this concept that you're talking about, as far as like the doctors being bought and these other kind of things, has been a long-standing thing. And quite a few of the states in the United States, maybe not a lot, like a few have put in laws to kind of help regulate that. The federal government expects a lot of the pharmaceutical companies and these companies to maintain a record of where they're going, what they're doing, and what they're providing. Essentially, even the American Medical Association and some of the other organizations have also printed and sort of revised like the ethics around what we do. So first of all, like when a drug representative or a pharmaceutical company comes in giving the lunches and these things, it has to be under the premise of they're actually providing like an educational, almost like a continuing medical education about their product, but it's also using statistics and research for us to see, okay, here's this product that we have, here's the data and the statistics and the research on this. And so it relies on me as the doctor who has gone through the training to analyze these things, to see the truth of what they're saying, to see if it's reliable or not. And also, doesn't even matter what they say if the medical insurance, for example, for the particular person, Aetna, Cigna, whomever, if they don't want that medication to be prescribed, they're not going to pay for it.
Okay.
So, yeah. So, it's, and lately over the past, I'd say even from even like 2010 and things like that, things have been much, much better about that. So, and And on the side, obviously, you're going to find people who are going to be swayed by seeing something. That's how advertising works. Like if you end up seeing a pen or a piece of paper with the name of something on it, it's going to come to mind, similar to what happens with the commercials. You see Ford, you see Toyota, you see BMW. It's still up to you as the consumer of that knowledge, of that whatever, to actually make the proper decision. And again, most of the information about these products is actually open to the public as well. So like the parent can also say, hey, look, I've read about this, blah, blah, blah. Here are my concerns. What do you think? And again, the teamwork concept that we sit down, talk about it, discuss the pros and the cons of whatever we're doing moving forward.
Okay. And I think that definitely makes sense. Just so that everyone knows, I'm kind of doing the devil's advocate thing, just because I feel comfortable taking that particular position. Okay. Like that's probably not the best way of phrasing that, but y'all get my point. So
going back to something you said earlier, sorry, before you continue, like with the vaccinations and us being paid for vaccines, like we don't. Vaccines.
Okay, so
it sounds bad, but there's actually more of a loss doing vaccinations than gain.
Why?
Actually, in terms of like the effort that's put in, the timing, like the kind of the documentation. So the vaccines, like for example, even here, there are a lot of vaccines that are provided by the government or as part of the vaccination program. Mm-hmm. So there's no kickback that we get from it outside of the consultation that we would normally do for having you come in for a visit anyway.
So it's kind of like with a cab with the meter running. As a doctor, the more procedures that you do, the more time that you spend, the more that you can bill. So instead of giving a vaccine to minimize the care, if you really wanted to be making a lot of money, you can just run out the meter by spending more time and treating people for things that could have been prevented, right?
Yeah. So, well, yeah, in a way, but also, like I said, like the amount of effort put into the vaccinations compared to like what you get out of it as a pediatrician, like you're purely doing it with the understanding that this is benefiting the child and also the public health mindset as well.
Okay, good to know. So I guess that what I'm hearing here, just kind of all around with what you're describing, is that the pediatrician is basically there for the child.
Yeah.
Okay. So taking that into account.
Sometimes that even means having tough conversations with the parents if, according to my assessment, knowledge and stuff like that, that the parent might be doing something contrary to what the child needs as well.
Okay, so, and then I guess that the way that you described it earlier is that it's all a team for the child, where the pediatrician is just one part of a team that supports the child. You're looking out for the child's best interests, and you're going to try to convey that to the parent and advocate for them. That's pretty fair.
And what also a lot of parents don't realize is that our advocating for the child is also advocating indirectly for the parents as well. Because the child's welfare is based on the welfare of the parents understanding how open they are, even if they're depressed or not. So a good pediatrician is also going to sort of like try and sort of assess like how the parents are doing. What's the environment like at home? Is there any kind of bullying? Is there abuse? Is there such a high standard at home that the child feels like anxious all the time trying to meet these things, which then consequently will cause the parent to feel tension or confusion or frustration. So again, in addition to being part of a team, like we're also kind of like a referee to kind of calm some of these things and smooth it out.
Okay, good to know. Now, I know that as far as people going into the pediatrician's office, you've got some people who treat it, again, like they're being interrogated. Others who treat it like, just kind of the opportunity to give a monologue and tell the complete story of everyone's life. So as far as the amount of information that we are giving to you as doctors, how much is really too much? How do we know what's relevant and what's not?
In general, like the best thing to do, if the pediatrician is comfortable enough to do that, they will kind of guide you with what they need based on the questions that they ask. So, and again, remembering that sometimes like they have a whole lot of patients to see in a day with varying issues. Like somebody might be suicidal, another person might be depressed, another person might be there for vaccines, etc. So the best thing to do is, let the pediatrician ask the questions. They'll ask open-ended questions to let you explain. They'll ask direct things. And forgive us sometimes if we sound like we're interrupting, because again, like we're kind of under pressure for time to help you as efficiently and quickly as possible, in addition to everyone else that's waiting in the line or in the waiting room for their appointments as well.
Okay, so one of the things that a lot of parents run into is that there are a lot of medical professionals, psychologist, dentist, pediatrician, other types of medical specialists. How much of this information should we be like giving to you, like as far as behavioral reports from school? What do we give you a copy of? What do we just kind of keep to ourselves?
Ideally, any reports, even like reports from the school, it's dependent on what the situation is. Obviously, like I don't need to know everything like the school writes, like for the report cards or things like that. But if there is an issue that I have to get involved in to actually help the child at school, like say, for example, if there's a performance issue that they might have to be assessed for, if there's some kind of developmental delay, do they have some kind of a hearing loss? Do they have a vision problem? Is it something like ADHD or autism or these other kind of things? So obviously, any of the reports or feedback that feeds into that is good for us to have copies of it, or emails, PDFs, etc. But again, it's more like the pediatrician usually will tell you, okay, I'm going to need feedback from the teachers. Here's a survey or a questionnaire to give them. Here's a questionnaire for you to fill out. Then you'll come back, send these things to me so I can review them before the next appointment, to review everything, to then come to the diagnosis and management.
That's actually a really good point, because I don't know if it ever occurred to me before to try to send the information in advance of a doctor's appointment, but I think that's actually a very handy tip that hopefully everyone.
That's not supposed to be handy. That's very important, because if you bring it to it, depending on how thick the information is, and if I have 15 to 30 minutes with you, it's almost impossible to go through all that stuff with a clear mind and getting the history from you and examining and doing everything in an efficient, timely way. So the best thing to do is to send it in advance. I have time to screen. I can write notes or put things in the chart in advance of the appointments. Then I'm ready and more efficient with what we do.
Okay, I think that's kind of a game changer. I think I'll try to do that more often, send that information to the doctor's office in advance. All right,
This
so
is a much better outcome that way.
I guess it makes sense, because that way you're not just cramming at the last minute and trying to speed read all of those various records. All right. So, that's pretty much all that I have. This has been very helpful. I know that I learned something. I hope the Tiny Bookstore community learned something as well. And with that, Dr. DeLouis, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and for joining the Tiny Bookstore Live.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. I'll see you soon.
Hopefully, but we'll see if I can get back.
It's like we'll talk about that. We'll
talk about that. Yeah,
I'll talk. Okay. All right, I'll see you.
Bye. Love you. Yeah.
Love you too. Bye. All right, y'all. So I hope that everyone learned a little bit of something. I know that I did. I think that it's comforting to know that the pediatrician is someone who's there, an extra set of eyes to just really help support our children. They're out to heal, they're out to help, and let's use those experts to the best of our ability. And so with that, we're going to pivot into a different direction and talking about breaking a reading slump. That's something that I know I've seen a lot of people talking about online and in various groups lately. Like, how do you break out of a time where you just either don't have the time or just don't feel like reading anymore? And I think that the first and most important thing to remember is, relax, don't stress about it. Reading at the end of the day is supposed to be something that is fun. So if you don't have the time to put it together, you don't really feel like reading, don't press yourself about it. Just kind of relax. That's step one. And I think step two is to kind of take a step back and try to just read anything for any period of time. A lot of people have the idea that if you're going to read, it's going to be this 3-hour endeavor where the lighting is just right and everything is quiet and you're completely uninterrupted. And in this day and age, doesn't really matter what you do. That's not necessarily going to be a reality. So I think that in that aspect, step 2 is to adjust your expectations for yourself and give yourself a break. Instead of expecting that you have to read for 3-4 hours at a time, even an hour at a time, just read anything for, even if it's just 2 to 5 minutes, just read. If you're not feeling the material that you're reading, okay, put it down and pick up something else. Pick up a comic book, pick up the side of the cereal container. As long as that's reading, that's just something to get you back into that habit. And again, as far as not feeling pressure to go ahead and complete something that you've started, I know that I used to have a lot of guilt when it comes to not quitting on a book. But I'm proud to say that I have learned to become a very good quitter. If I am a few pages into the book and I'm not feeling it, I will put it down and move on. There are literally millions of books that are published every single year, and life is too short to commit to a book that you're just not feeling. So take that pressure off of yourself, chuck that book aside, and pick up something else. But as far as, a set strategy and as far as a procedure that I follow, if I'm ever feeling like a reading slump, is step 1, reading short things. That means essay collections, letter collections, articles, poems, anything that doesn't take a terribly long commitment to read. That's what I'm going to read. I'll get back to, like I said, comic books. I'll read a kid's book because reading is reading, and Kidlit it's really underrated. They've got solid stories and great pictures. So again, number 1, relax. Number 2, take the pressure off yourself. Number 3, read things that are short. There are a lot of short story collections out there. There are quick reads that you can find online for the bargain price of free. So, there's always great material out there, especially in shorter formats. Now, the next tip that I have is set a time where you're not committing to reading for a whole chapter. Set it to a clock. I know I mentioned earlier that even if you're reading for 2 minutes, that's still progress. Consider that a solid read. There are letters that are 1 page. You can get that read in 2 to 5 minutes. So setting short time reading goals instead of saying that you're going to read a whole chapter, just commit to a letter or a page, just anything to snap you out of that rut, because a lot of times a reading slump is just a rut. And again, sometimes it's because you're struggling against something you don't want to read. Sometimes it's because you're starting to get mired in that habit of not reading. So, just start reading something, even if it's something short. Now, last and certainly not least, my way to break out of a reading slump is just read fun things. This is not a reading slump isn't the time to try to tackle War and Peace or Infinite Jest. That's the time to get back in touch with the things that bring you joy and things that are just fun to read. I know that people knock comic books and graphic novels, but I've mentioned that 3 times in the last 2 minutes. So as you can tell, that's something that I find that's relaxing and fun to read. And that's what I recommend that you all should do too. Now, one of the things that I mentioned as far as, getting into short stories and essays, I want to talk about a book that's coming out on Tuesday by Zora Neale Hurston. It's a collection called You Don't Know Us Negroes, and it's actually one of our favorite books for the month of February. And I realized that when I was talking about, breaking a reading slump and getting into reading shorter reads, that this is a great way to do that, because Zora Neale Hurston is a phenomenal writer as far as the language that she uses, the structure. Even though these are things that were written 100 years ago, it still holds up. And a lot of what she is including in this collection, some of it, it's work that people have read before. Some of it is relatively new, but I think that they take a lot of interesting approaches to certain topics that are relevant right now. Like, some people aren't aware of the fact that Zora Neale Hurston was not the biggest fan of Brown v. Board of Education, which is a little bit surprising, but when you read her reasoning for it, it actually does make sense. And I think that it was a harbinger for arguments that ended up coming in the later 60s and the 70s as far as what integration really meant and how when you're looking at true integration and true equality, that there's a certain stigma that was attached to teachers of color. And just kind of getting into the idea that, as far as true integration, in order for that to be a good thing, that means seeing everyone as equals. And it really did make me think. So I'm excited with this collection that's coming out on Tuesday. Again, it's called You Don't Know Us Negroes by Zora Neale Hurston. I know that one of the things that's taking off online this year is a commitment for people to read books by at least 20 Black female authors this year. And if you haven't started, Zora Neale Hurston is a great place to start. If you haven't read Their Eyes Were Watching God, pick that up too. It's available at your local library. So, again, Zora Neale Hurston, You Don't Know Us Negroes, a great collection of essays and shorter works that I advise that everyone get a hold of and read. Okay, so moving on to the next topic, and one of my areas of passion happens to be critical thinking and things making sense. And over the last, I'd say 2 months, one of the people that has been in the media a lot as far as critical thinking, anti-vaccine, the whole COVID thing is, Aaron Rodgers, quarterback for the Green Bay Packers. Now, I'm not going to get into, any type of turf battles, Steelers versus Green Bay, whatever. All I've got to say is we don't see Big Ben doing such things. But I digress. One of the things that I started thinking about the whole Aaron Rodgers situation is that it really does show us some of the flaws that we're seeing nowadays as far as people thinking well, and also the overall tone of social media and the media in general. Now, in the course of about 11 months, Aaron Rodgers went from being the possible future host of Jeopardy to someone that people thought was a charlatan and a moron. Like, people were actually out here calling him a moron. And where I think that's kind of, it's negative, and it's part of the culture that we're looking at today, where there's no middle ground, that you're either on board with what everyone else is thinking and you're great, or you're not on board with what everyone is thinking and you're not very bright and just kind of evil. And I prefer that we just kind of paint in shades of gray. Nothing is going to be completely black and white, especially when we're talking about people. And I think that one of the important things to remember is that intelligent people can be wrong. They're often wrong regularly. That's just part of being human, right? But one of the things about Aaron Rodgers is that he said that he was a free thinker and an independent thinker. And I'm thinking, okay, that's interesting. A lot of people are saying that they're free thinkers and independent thinkers and doing their own research. And I think it's very important to remember that being a free thinker and an independent thinker is not necessarily the same thing as being a critical thinker. Being a free thinker means that you're just kind of walking your own beat. You're not necessarily following everything that you're being told without scrutiny. And that's great. You shouldn't necessarily accept everything that's being told to you and just accepting things at face value, going along with the group. The problem is that part of critical thinking is making sense, making sure that the resources that you're using are well supported, that they're well accepted, and that they're solid. And there are certain times when the majority of the information out there might not necessarily be accurate, and what the masses are saying may not necessarily be accurate. But just because it happens to be, widely believed, or what the masses tend to believe, doesn't necessarily mean that it's right, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. So I think that one of the lessons that we can learn from this whole Aaron Rodgers experience is, let's go ahead and analyze the information that we're given, but let's use reliable sources. And let's actually question things and question them in a way that makes sense. There's a difference between being a critic and being a crank. I totally understand not accepting things at face value. That's certainly something that I don't do. And as a critical thinker, you shouldn't take things at face value. You need to take a step back and question whether what's being followed is logical, whether it's something that squares with what solid research has supported, and again, whether it even makes sense. one of the issues that Rodgers brought up in his original interview with Pat McAfee on the Pat McAfee show was that some of the NFL's policies didn't necessarily make sense, and there was a lot of groupthink. Now, I watched the whole interview with Aaron Rodgers. I watch the Pat McAfee show regularly. It really is a great show. And one thing that I noticed about what he said was that, the policies didn't necessarily make sense. Now, he was wrong about a whole lot of what he said, as far as ivermectin and the research that he was following. A lot of that was just kind of garbage, right? But one of the things that he mentioned about the NFL's policies where they weren't testing the unvaccinated regularly and not having them wear masks, he was someone who was very wrong about a lot, but he raised a very valid point. And it's something that was being overlooked by people in the media, which is that if people who are vaccinated can actually spread COVID, then perhaps they should be tested more regularly. So this was a perfect example of someone who had very wrong information on a lot of what he was saying, but some of it actually did make sense. If we're looking at things from a neutral viewpoint and we're analyzing the logic behind certain policies, can we say that this makes sense? And in that very narrow example that he raised, no, the policy didn't necessarily make sense. And I think that questioning that was something that was valid. So again, I think the takeaway here is that as a critical thinker, it's your obligation to go out there and make sure that the information that you're using is good. And yes, go out and question things, point out things that don't make sense, but also understand that it's also your obligation to make sure that you're using reliable resources and that you're not being a crank and just being a regular critic. And what I mean by a crank is that the type of person where you get into a debate with them and they are just insisting on questioning everything. There is absolutely nothing reliable that you can put out. They won't find anything you have to say reliable. Doesn't matter what source you have. They're going to sit here and say that, hey, I don't believe you. What else do you have? And I think that's the neighborhood of being a crank. If you're someone who's actually being a critical thinker, you have to concede the point when the information that you're being presented with is reliable enough. And if you're at a point where nothing that you're hearing is reliable enough to you, that means you're the problem. That means that you're not thinking critically, that you're just being a crank. And again, I think that that's very important that as we're having these conversations, that we're being reasonable, that we are not being biased, that we're being objective, we're using good information, and that we're not just objecting to things just for the fun of it, just because, you don't agree and you just disagree in your gut. So you're going to shoot down everything, no matter how reliable the information may seem to most reasonable people. So again, the critical thinking lesson of the day is question things, but don't go into that entire crank territory, and make sure that you're using reliable sources, and that, if something makes sense, just go ahead and concede the point. That's what critical thinkers happen to do. All right, so to wrap things up, I'd like to announce that the Tiny Bookstore is having a birthday. We're actually coming up on 3 years of being around. And for that, we're going to have a little miniature, again, online type celebration to, just kind of celebrate being here for 3 years, and hopefully we'll be here a lot longer. We will be having a sale until, I'm not sure, probably at least the next week. We will be having some promotions online, and I know that I am glad to be here and still be moving forward, even though, the world seems a little bit sideways. And one of the things that I've discovered that I love doing as far as being in this bookstore is talking to people about great ideas, introducing you all to new books, and helping to learn myself and to help, other people learn things as well. And I want to thank you all for keeping us here, because if it weren't for the Tiny Bookstore community, we wouldn't exist. I would be back, doing the lawyer thing 100% of the time. So again, thank you all for, helping us to reach this 3-year milestone. Now, as far as a little bit of news, on February 5th, we have a guest author coming into the Tiny Bookstore Live. His name is Jack Lessenberry, and here is his book. It is Reason versus Racism, A Newspaper Family, Race and Justice. It's basically about the Block family that owns the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. It's a fascinating read, and I'm really looking forward to talking to Mr. Lessenberry about it on February 5th, same time. That's going to be 3 o'clock here on the Tiny Bookstore Live, and I hope that you all be able to join us for that. And a little bit further ahead than that, on February 12th, we have Leah Henderson joining us on stream for the Tiny Bookstore Live. So with that, that is all I have for today. I want to thank you all for joining us for the Tiny Bookstore Live. If you happen to be in the Northeast, I think that it's probably time to go and grab that, bread, eggs, and, whatever else, that you need to get in advance of a snowstorm. And I look forward to seeing you all next week, 3 o'clock for the Tiny Bookstore Live. Have a great weekend.